Today's lecture is called Multicultural Modern, and it will parallel the walking tour on Friday. And the lecture will conclude with a short video that will also be part of, that will be an introduction to the walking tour. It's a video on the number 7 train that goes out to Flushing.
Professor, I just have a question about the syllabus. I think on the, it says the 3rd and the 4th.
It may say the 3rd and the 4th, but the university in its wisdom has abolished the 4th. The 4th will not exist this year. It is to be a reading day for you, so they've abolished classes. Initially, the 4th was to be a fictive Monday. So it was going to be Monday and Monday, or a fictive Wednesday. Yeah, but it was going to be acted as if it was a fictive Wednesday. So you were going to have classes back to back. And they've decided to abolish that and turn it into a reading day. So there are no classes next Tuesday. Next Monday is the last class. Tuesday is a reading day. Okay. A cram day or a relaxed day or whatever. Okay, but then the exam is the following Monday. Okay. So they changed that after the early in the semester, after we'd already done the syllabuses. Okay. So. But it's a good reminder. I'll send out an email blast to everybody reminding them of both the walking tour and that Tuesday is the last class is on Monday. Okay. Any other questions that people have? Okay. The Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965. A federal piece of legislation governing immigration, remade the social character of New York City in very fundamental ways. It also changed the whole pattern of immigration, not just in terms of origins, but also the character of immigration, so that it became an experience unlike that previous immigration generations had ever faced. Today's lecture will try to detail both the character of that transformation and the impact that it had on New York City from '65 to the present. The Immigration and Nationality Act, this 1965 legislation, abolished the basis on which immigration had existed for the previous 100 years. It abolished national origin quotas. Which had been in place, and had effectively been themselves curtailed by the 1924 Act that closed America's doors effectively to immigration. So there had been a lot of immigration, as you know, we talked about at the end of the 19th century through Ellis Island. An act in 1924 had closed most of those earlier doors to immigration. This new act was going to open them, but was going to open them on a different basis. The act in '24, remember, that was tied to, we talked about briefly, the Red Scare that followed World War I. And that continued with anxieties following World War II around Cold War anxieties about foreigners in our midst. Had granted, the earlier acts had granted residency on the bases of those already here. The 1924 Act had particularly discriminated on the basis of race. The new legislation proposed in 1965 by a Harlem congressman, Emanuel Seller, and a senator from Michigan, Philip Hart, was also heavily supported by Ted Kennedy, who remained, as you know, till his death, very anxious and concerned about making immigration, in his mind, fair. The new act in '65 was proposed in the wake of the civil rights movement, so it was shaped by these new kinds of notions about what constituted fairness, in particular around racial discrimination. And the Civil Rights Act of '65 and the Voting Rights Act of '65 were signed into legislation at the same time as this Nationality Act was passed. Here are its provisions. It opened doors to new countries in the East and Southern Hemisphere that had previously had limited access to immigration. It provided an annual limit on visas, initially for China, Japan, the Eastern Hemisphere, to 170,000, but in particular with a limit of 20,000 to any one country. And it limited the Western Hemisphere to a total of 120,000. The key, however, was that only 20,000 could come from any one country under '65. But here were the specific provisions that provided exemptions to those limits. First, priority was to be given to unmarried adults whose parents are citizens or were citizens, to spouses or offspring of permanent residents, and then married siblings or married offspring. That's to say, all of this was about family reunification. That was the priority, family reunification. Not simply the hungry and the poor, but the reconstitution of families based on those who were already here. The second priority was to be given to professionals, scientists, and artists. That's to say, to skilled people with needed professional, technical expertise in the post-war era. It would be tied, as you can imagine, briefly, to what will be called the brain drain in Europe or South Asia. The third provision, priority, was to be refugees from communist or communist-controlled countries, or those, and this will resonate with the present, priority for those from the Middle East, oil countries. That's to say, there was a geopolitics that informed the new immigration pattern, still in the shadow of the Cold War. Priority was not being given to people fleeing from totalitarian countries if they came from a right-wing totalitarianship. They were only being granted priority if they came from a left-wing totalitarianship, as it was understood. That's to say, communist countries. Cubans would be welcomed, but Haitian boat people would be sent back, to give you an example, where the dictator was the Duvalier family, Papa Doc and then his son. The United States was not interested in destabilizing right-wing dictatorships because those were generally favorable to U.S. business and American capitalist investors. So while we didn't mean we were applauding the dictatorships, we turned a blind eye to that. The priority, rather, was what was good for American business, or American, as it was understood, free trade and American interests. In contrast, it was understood that left-wing countries that were going to nationalize American corporate interests in those countries were not to be favored, given favorable status. So there was an interest in destabilizing those left-wing countries, but maintaining the stability of right-wing countries. The intention of this new policy was not to end discrimination, however. It was not to change the ethnic mix of America, according to its leaders. In fact, the people who led this legislation argued that discrimination and broadening the ethnic mix was neither the intent nor desirable, necessarily. Senator Kennedy stated, for instance, our cities will not be flooded with 1 million immigrants annually. And secondly, he added, the ethnic mix of the country will not be upset. Of course, he was wrong on both counts. And whether he was blind or whether he was just choosing to minimize what he thought would be, what would happen in effect, we don't know. We do know the result. It completely changed the ethnic mix in three fundamental ways, and nowhere more profoundly, no city more profoundly than New York City, though it profoundly changed almost all the cities in the Southwest as well, Phoenix, Los Angeles, etc., to this day stimulating immigration acts in some of those states. How did it change? First, it shifted immigration to the third world. It no longer was coming from Europe, whether it was southern Europe, as it had in Eastern Europe, as the immigration pattern had changed to New York with Italians and East Europeans in the 1880s, 90s, turn of the century, or from Northern Europe, as had been the case earlier in the 19th century from people from Germany, Scandinavia, and the British Isles. Rather, it was now to come from the third world countries, which meant in particular it was going to open the door to people from South Asia, East Asia, and Africa, and Latin America, and Central America, South America. Secondly, it made legal immigration an option for well-educated and more affluent people who had skills and high training. So legal immigration, which had earlier been offered to the poor, to anyone who came over, but remember again Emma Lazarus's poem on the pedestal of the Statue of Liberty. It was for the huddled masses yearning to be free. Now it's for the well-affluent yearning to make earning to use their skills and advance themselves in well-paid jobs. Okay? They came legally. It was a brain drain for nurses, disproportionately from places like the Philippines, doctors, again from Eastern Asia and elsewhere, computer scientists from India, the Philippines, but as easily from England or Germany. The origin was all. Now, you should note that this origin had already been seen in the recruitment and repackaging of scientists who had come in the wake of World War II. Some of you may remember seeing a film about The Good German. And that's a film that talks about, with George Clooney, as I recall, right? A film that celebrates the ways in which the United States managed to repackage or rethink the political exigencies that made it attractive and desirable to attract someone who might have been a Nazi scientist and hold them to a different standard because their skill could be useful in creating America's military arsenal or its desire to conquer space. And so there was a kind of flexibility that had already been seen in the response to World War II that now gets encoded and encouraged in this new legislation at some level. So it changes legal immigration, but it also shifts the role of traditional immigrant seekers of the Golden Door. Those with little elsewhere seeking a better life, they also come, but they're forced to use extra legal means because their door is closed to them. Border crossings, people who simply overstay their welcome a bit or overstay a visa, marriages of convenience. There have been films about that as well, some of you will recall seeing, based in New York. Migrant labor, a process in all cases that, it should be remembered, was as much about pull as push. That's to say, there were forces pushing people out of poor countries, making them understand, and Hollywood was reminding them, that there was considerable riches still to be found in films like Wall Street in New York. And American films were talking about that. I suggest some of that, some of you know in that article that some of you read in the beginning. Some of the images about New York are ones about its attractiveness, Miracle on 34th Street, to more recent films. But there were also there were also factors that were as much, in that sense, about pull. Things that were attracting them here, but also push those who were getting them out. Both were combining. There were employers who wanted this labor the people who would be driving through the Long Island corners, street corners, who are looking for people who can mow their lawn, who can help provide inexpensive labor for the renovation of the back patio that's being done by a local contractor. So contractors would be looking for that kind of labor. There were people needing seasonal labor to pick crops so that we can all have blackberries and blueberries with our breakfast in the morning. So there were reasons in which all of us were dependent and encouraging that kind of process. It wasn't simply the person who was out there bringing those people in. We crave the blueberries. Okay? We crave the blackberries. So we're involved and complicitous and involved in that, even though we may not understand always that logic. We don't go to the store and say, gosh, who picked these things and how are they being paid? And is this illegal labor? And am I supporting this? We say, blueberries, or at least I do. So it was a process that takes place nationwide, but nowhere does its extent of all of its aspects play out, I would argue, with the scope, intensity, and numbers as New York City. And as I've tried to suggest, it isn't simply a matter of us all not being involved in it on different levels. Numbers tell part of the story. The 1990 population of New York is 7.3 million. That was a number that had remained virtually unchanged for 40 or 50 years. Somewhere between 7.25 and 7.5 million people. By July of 2007, the last month for which I have data, the population in New York had grown almost a million, to just under 8.3 million. It was then an all-time high for New York City. So just between 1990 and these next 2 decades, the population had grown from 7.25 million to 8.25 million, roughly. That's a huge increase that had not taken place before. As importantly, the metropolitan region had now grown to 8.5 million. These were people who were not just settling in New York City within its political boundaries. They're settling, think of the Cuban populations in parts of New Jersey, the Hispanic populations in most of cities like Paterson, and elsewhere, yes.
Is that 8.5 million in addition to the 8.3?
No, altogether. Altogether, total. Where did these people come from? Well, one could argue, is it simply that we were all having more babies? And in truth, the answer is no. In fact, the population, the increase, was due almost entirely to immigration and migration. Okay? The fertility rates of the native population, those who were already here, stayed below the replacement level of 2.1 children per woman. In fact, only in the last couple of years has it reached that replacement level, and that's because the new immigrant population is having children at a rate higher than that of the pre-immigrant population. Okay? In addition to this dramatic increase, as you might imagine, the change has also affected the racial composition of the city. The New York City population at the new millennium, 2000. White, and I put that in quotes because it's never quite clear exactly who fits into that category. It's partially about you get a form and you can decide whether you're white or black. Okay? We're a particularly kind of racialized society that's believed that if you have one drop of black blood, you're black. Why you don't decide that if you have one drop of white blood, you're white, reflects the ways in which we think about race in this country. Okay? So in any case, whiteness, which we've also seen has changed, now though means all the earlier ethnics that were not always thought to be quite so white. So white ethnics is about 44% of the city. 3.5 million. Black, which meant in this case Afro-Caribbean, Afro-American, was more than a quarter, 26%. Asian, about 10%. Hispanic or Latino was again about a little more than a quarter, 26%, almost 27%. The key is they could be of any race. They could That's why on your census there's a separate designation to indicate if you are Latino and whether you are Latino, black, or white, how you imagine yourself. Okay? So more than half the city, and these numbers have only increased in every city, are now people who are imagined, self-defined, and defined by others as non-white populations. And dramatically large numbers of these people are black and Latino or Hispanic.
Excuse me, Professor?
Yes.
Could you just quickly go over those percentages?
Sure. Think of it basically as 1/4 are black, and all those categories, 1/4 are Hispanic, and the rest are white or other. Asian are 10%. I'm sorry, Asian are 10%.
And white, you had
At 44%, I think we had something like that. Probably a little less.
100%, but
It probably is. And because I'm actually rounding out numbers for you. Okay. They actually, I can give you the precise numbers, but you don't really need to know them, right? No, you got it right. Okay. Think of it as 4 out of 10 that are white, and that number, of course, is dramatically declining since then. What are the characteristics of this new immigrant settlement? Well, the economic differences among groups was also shaped by the '65 Act and its subsequent modifications. The legal people come with skills. An illegal cadre, however, is created by the Act. This group is predominantly poor and without skills. So the legal tend to be more affluent, middle class, professionals. The illegal tend to be poor. And the post, it should be noted, 9/11 groups in particular are people who are particularly stigmatized and vulnerable to the new politics of fear that marked the cities, of course, as well. Not only, however, is there this ethnic and racial and economic differences, but they then, all of which we come to celebrate in kind of multiculturalism, but we need to know that that multiculturalism is not usually mixed in any one place. People live in segregated neighborhoods, or in neighborhoods that are defined by economy and by ethnicity, race. We have in that sense what we might describe in the 20th century, 21st century, something that we might call multicultural segregation in New York City, the details of which I will go over with you in much more on Monday. But let me give you a sense of the major patterns and the case studies and who was here. The major immigrant groups in the 21st century, in which the foreign-born, it should be noted, are higher than they had been in any time since 1910. So New York City had become, in the 21st century, as an immigrant city, much the way it had been a century before, but had not been in the century interceding. Who are these immigrants? The largest immigrant group in Manhattan, New York, by the way, is in Manhattan. Does anyone know what that largest immigrant group would be? All right, the Dominicans, from the Dominican Republic. The second largest group?
Maybe Russians?
No. Okay, Chinese. Now, all of these categories some of them become a little tricky. Chinese come from many different areas in China, and there are regional differences. It's a little like talking about Italians, were they from North Italy or South Italy, but we're talking about the third group were the Jamaicans, and the fourth, Guyanese, from Guyana, then Mexicans, then Ecuadorians and Haitians. Just listen to the country, Trinidad, Tobago, Colombia, then Russia. That Russia is number 10. Only when I get to number 11 do I get to Italians, somebody from Eastern Europe. But I talked about multicultural segregation. It's not just the numbers. 60% of the Dominicans live in Washington Heights. Okay. More than half of the Poles. You wanted to see Polish New York, where would you go? Anybody? Well, not just Brooklyn. Greenpoint. Okay. Greenpoint in Brooklyn. 1 in 5 of Poles were settling in Greenpoint. 2/3 of the Haitians, a majority of the Russians and the Ukrainians settle in Brooklyn, but again in very particular sections. Most of the people in Brooklyn are in the outer parts of Brooklyn, right? Whereabouts?
Coney Island.
All right, the area, Coney Island and? Anybody else? Bay Ridge, okay? All the way out. When I was making a film about the Ukrainian miners who were on strike in the Donetsk, I wanted original music and original footage. I simply went out there and I found all the records that I needed, the same ones I had heard when I was in the Ukraine. They were all there, and it looked as if you were in Little Ukraine or Little Russia, the people who were there. The majority of the Bangladeshi, the Indians, the Koreans, the Colombians, the Trinidadians, Queens, while the largest community of Greeks remains in Astoria, Queens. So again, it's not just Queens, as you'll see in very particular districts of areas of Queens.
With the original percentages were 25% Black, 24, and 10% Asian, does that include Indians or
No.
South Asians? No.
South Asians. Sorry. The Chinese settle in Chinatown, as you know, but they're as large in numbers in Sunset Park, and there's a huge Chinese population in Flushing and Forest Hills, as you would know as well. The Mexicans are scattered through the Bronx, Manhattan and the Harlem area, Brooklyn and especially Queens. But in all these areas, when we say scattered, they're in very particular enclaves and in districts. And the districts are often defined by, given how poor they are, where they can afford housing. So these districts tend to be, again, ethnic, class-defined areas in which they live, as you would know.